The Easter Parade. Neither of the Grimes sisters would have a happy life, and looking back, it almost seemed that the trouble began with their parents' divorce. That happened in 1930, when Sarah was 9 years old and Emily 5. Their mother, who encouraged both girls to call her Pookie, took them out of New York to a rented house in Tenafly, New Jersey, where she thought the schools would be better and where she hoped to launch a career in suburban real estate. It didn't work out. Very few of her plans for independence ever did, and they left Tenafly after 2 years. But it was a memorable time for the girls. "Doesn't your father ever come home?" other children would ask, and Sarah would always take the lead in explaining what a divorce was. "Do you ever get to see him?" "Sure we do." "Where does he live?" "In New York City." "What does he do?" "He writes headlines. He writes the headlines in the New York Sun." And the way she said it made it clear that they ought to be impressed. Anyone could be a flashy, irresponsible reporter or a steady drudge of a rewrite man. But the man who wrote the headlines, the man who read through all the complexities of daily news to pick out salient points, and who then summed everything up in a few well-chosen words artfully composed to fit a limited space. There was a consummate journalist and a father worthy of the name. Once when the girls went to visit him in the city, he took them through the Sun plant and they saw everything. "The first edition's ready to run," he said, "so we'll go down to the press room and watch that. Then I'll show you around upstairs." He escorted them down an iron stairway that smelled of ink and newsprint and out into a great underground room where the high rotary presses stood in ranks. Workmen hurried everywhere, all wearing crisp little squared-off hats made of intricately folded newspaper. "Why did they wear those paper hats, Daddy?" Emily asked. "Well, they'd probably tell you it's to keep the ink out of their hair, but I think they just wear 'em to look jaunty." "What does jaunty mean?" "Oh, it means sort of like that bear of yours," he said, pointing to a garnet-studded pin in the form of a teddy bear that she'd worn on her dress that day and hoped he might notice. "That's a very jaunty bear." They watched the curved, freshly cast metal page plates slide in on conveyor rollers to be clamped into place on the cylinders. Then after a ringing of bells, they watched the presses roll. The steel floor shuddered under their feet, which tickled, and the noise was so overwhelming that they couldn't talk. They could only look at each other and smile, and Emily covered her ears with her hands. White streaks of newsprint ran in every direction through the machines, and finished newspapers came riding out in neat, overlapped abundance. "What'd you think of that?" Walter Grimes asked his daughters as they climbed the stairs. "Now we'll take a look at the city room." It was an acre of desks, where men sat hammering typewriters. "That place up front where the desks are shoved together is the city desk," he said. "The city editor's the bald man talking on the telephone. And the man over there is even more important. He's the managing editor." "Where's your desk, Daddy?" Sarah asked. "Oh, I work on the copy desk. On the rim. See over there?" He pointed to a big semicircular table of yellow wood. One man sat at the hub of it and 6 others sat around the rim, reading or scribbling with pencils. "Is that where you write the headlines?" "Well, writing heads is part of it, yes. What happens is, when the reporters and rewrite men finish their stories, they give them to a copy boy. That young fellow there is a copy boy, and he brings them to us. We check them over for grammar and spelling and punctuation. Then we write the heads, and they're ready to go." "Hello, Charlie," he said to a man passing on his way to the water cooler. "Charlie, I'd like you to meet my girls. This is Sarah, and this is Emily." "Well," the man said, bending down from the waist, "what a pair of sweethearts. How do you do?" Next, he took them to the teletype room, where they could watch wire service news coming in from all over the world, and then to the composing room where everything was set into type and fitted into page forms. "You ready for lunch?" he inquired. "Want to go to the ladies' room first?" As they walked out across City Hall Park in the spring sunshine, he held them both by the hand. They both wore light coats over their best dresses, with white socks and black patent leather shoes, and they were nice-looking girls. Sarah was the dark one, with a look of trusting innocence that would never leave her. Emily, a head shorter, was blonde and thin and very serious. City Hall doesn't look like much, does it? Walter Grimes said. But see the big building over there, through the trees? The dark red one? That's the World. Was, I should say. It folded last year. Greatest daily newspaper in America. Well, but the Sun's the best now, right? Sarah said. Oh no, honey, the Sun isn't really much of a paper. It isn't? Why? Sarah looked worried. Oh, it's kind of a reactionary. What does that mean? It means very, very conservative, right? Very Republican. Aren't we Republicans? I guess your mother is, baby. I'm not. Oh. He had 2 drinks before lunch, ordering ginger ale for the girls. Then, when they were tucking into their chicken a la king and mashed potatoes, Emily spoke up for the first time since they'd left the office. Daddy, if you don't like the Sun, why do you work there? His long face, which both girls considered handsome, looked tired. Because I need a job, little rabbit, he said. Jobs are getting hard to find. Oh, I suppose if I were very talented, I might move on. But I'm just, I'm only a copy desk man. It wasn't much to take back to Tenafly, but at least they could still say he wrote headlines. And if you think writing headlines is easy, you're wrong, Sarah told a rude boy on the playground after school one day. Emily, though, was a stickler for accuracy, and as soon as the boy was out of earshot, she reminded her sister of the facts. He's only a copy desk man, she said. Esther Grimes, or Pookie, was a small, active woman whose life seemed pledged to achieving and sustaining an elusive quality she called flair. She pored over fashion magazines, dressed tastefully, and tried many ways of fixing her hair. But her eyes remained bewildered, and she never quite learned to keep her lipstick within the borders of her mouth, which gave her an air of dazed and vulnerable uncertainty. She found more flair among rich people than in the middle class, and so she aspired to the attitudes and mannerisms of wealth in raising her daughters. She always sought nice communities to live in, whether she could afford them or not, and she tried to be strict on matters of decorum. Dear, I wish you wouldn't do that, she said to Sarah at breakfast one morning. Do what? Dunk your toast crusts in your milk that way? Oh. Sarah drew a long soaked crust of buttered toast out of her milk glass and brought it dripping to her reaching mouth. Why? She asked after she'd chewed and swallowed. Just because. It doesn't look nice. Emily's 4 whole years younger than you, and she doesn't do baby things like that. And that was another thing. She always suggested, in hundreds of ways, that Emily had more flair than Sarah. When it became clear that she would not succeed in Tenafly real estate, she began to make frequent all-day trips to other towns, or into the city, leaving the girls with other families. Sarah didn't seem to mind her absences, but Emily did. She didn't like the smells of other people's homes. She couldn't eat. She would worry all day, picturing hideous traffic accidents, and if Pookie was an hour or 2 late in coming to get them, she would cry like a baby. One day in the fall, they went to stay with a family named Clark. They brought their paper dolls along in case they were left to themselves, which seemed likely. All 3 of the Clark children were boys, but Mrs. Clark had admonished her oldest son, Myron, to be a good host, and he took his duty seriously. He was 11 and spent most of the day showing off for them. Hey, watch, he kept saying, watch this. There was a horizontal steel pipe supported by steel stanchions at the far end of the Clarks' backyard, and Myron was very good at skinning the cat. He would run for the bar, his shirt tail flapping beneath his sweater, seize it in both hands, swing his heels up, under, and over it, and hang by the knees. Then he'd reach up, turn himself inside out, and drop to the ground in a puff of dust. Later, he led his brothers and the Grimes girls in a complicated game of war, after which they went indoors to examine his stamp collection. And when they came outside again, there was nothing much to do. "Hey, look," he said. "Sarah's just tall enough to go under the bar without touching it." It was true. The top of her head cleared the bar by about half an inch. "I know what let's do," Myron said. "Let's have Sarah run at the bar as fast as she can, and she'll go skimming right under it, and it'll look really neat." A distance of some 30 yards was established. The others stood on the sidelines to watch, and Sarah started to run, her long hair flying. What nobody realized was that Sarah running would be taller than Sarah standing still. Emily realized it a fraction of a second too late, when there wasn't even time to cry out. The bar caught Sarah just above the eye with a sound Emily would never forget. Ding! And then she was writhing and screaming in the dirt with blood all over her face. Emily wet her pants as she raced for the house with the Clark boys. Mrs. Clark screamed a little too when she saw Sarah. Then she wrapped her in a blanket. She had heard that accident victims sometimes go into shock, and drove her to the hospital with Emily and Myron in the back seat. Sarah had stopped crying by then. She never cried much, but Emily had only begun. She cried all the way to the hospital and in the hall outside the emergency room, from which Mrs. Clark emerged 3 times to say, "No fracture and no concussion and 7 stitches." Then they were all back at the house. "I've never seen anyone bear pain so well," Mrs. Clark kept saying. And Sarah was lying on the sofa in the darkened living room with most of her face swollen purple and blue, with a heavy bandage blinding one eye and a towel full of ice over the bandage. The boys were out in the yard again, but Emily wouldn't leave the living room. "You must let your sister rest," Mrs. Clark told her. "Run along outside now, dear." "That's okay," Sarah said in a strange, distant voice. "She can stay." So Emily was allowed to stay, which was probably a good thing because she would have fought and kicked if anyone had tried to remove her from where she stood on the Clarks' ugly carpet, biting her wet fist. She wasn't crying now. She was only watching her prostrate sister in the shadows and feeling wave on wave of a terrible sense of loss. "It's okay, Emmy," Sarah said in that faraway voice. "It's okay. Don't feel bad. Pookie'll come soon." Sarah's eye wasn't damaged. Her wide, deep brown eyes remained the dominant feature in a face that would become beautiful. But for the rest of her life, a fine little blue-white scar wavered down from one eyebrow into the lid, like the hesitant stroke of a pencil, and Emily could never look at it without remembering how well her sister had borne pain. It reminded her, too, time and again, of her own susceptibility to panic and her unfathomable dread of being alone. It was Sarah who gave Emily her first information about sex. They were eating orange popsicles and fooling around a broken hammock in the yard of their house in Larchmont, New York. That was one of the other suburban towns they lived in after Tenafly. And as Emily listened, her mind filled with confusion and troubling images. "And you mean they put it up inside you?" "Yep, all the way. And it hurts." "What if it doesn't fit?" "Oh, it fits. They make it fit." "And then what?" "Then you have a baby. That's why you don't do it until after you're married." Except you know Elaine Simcoe in the 8th grade? She did it with a boy and started having a baby, and that's why she had to leave school. Nobody even knows where she is now." "You sure? Elaine Simcoe?" "Positive." "Well, but why would she want to do a thing like that?" "The boy seduced her." "What does that mean?" Sarah took a long, slow suck of her popsicle. "You're too young to understand." "I am not." "But you said it hurts, Sarah. If it hurts, why would she—" "Well, it hurts, but it feels good, too. You know how sometimes when you're taking a bath, or maybe you put your hand down there and kind of rub around and it feels—" "Oh." And Emily lowered her eyes in embarrassment. "I see." She often said "I see" about things that she didn't wholly understand. And so, for that matter, did Sarah. Neither of them understood why their mother found it necessary to change homes so often. For example, they'd be just beginning to make friends in one place when they'd move to another, but they never questioned it. Pookie was inscrutable in many ways. I tell my children everything, she would boast to other adults. We don't have any secrets in this family. And then in the next breath, she would lower her voice to say something the girls weren't supposed to hear. In keeping with the terms of the divorce agreement, Walter Grimes came out to visit the girls 2 or 3 times a year in whatever house they were renting, and sometimes he would spend the night on the living room sofa. The year Emily was 10, she lay awake for a long time on Christmas night, listening to the unaccustomed sound of her parents' voices downstairs. They were talking and talking, and because she had to know what was going on, she acted like a baby. She called out for her mother. "What is it, dear?" Pookie turned on the light and bent over, smelling of gin. "My stomach's upset." "Do you want some bicarbonate?" "No." "What do you want then?" "I don't know." "You're just being silly. Let me tuck you in and you just think about all the nice things you got for Christmas and go to sleep. And you mustn't call me again. Promise?" "Okay, because Daddy and I are having a very important talk. We're talking over a lot of things we should have discussed a long, long time ago, and we're coming to a new understanding." She gave Emily a wet kiss, turned out the light, and hurried back downstairs, where the talking went on, and Emily lay waiting for her sleep in a warm flush of happiness. Coming to a new understanding. It was like something a divorced mother in the movies might say just before the big music comes up for the fade out. But the next morning unfolded like all the other last mornings of his visits. He was as quiet and polite as a stranger at breakfast, and Pookie avoided his eyes. Then he called a taxi to take him to the train. At first, Emily thought maybe he had only gone back to the city to get his belongings, but that hope evaporated in the days and weeks that followed. She could never find the words to ask her mother about it, and she didn't mention it to Sarah. Both girls had what dentists call an overbite and children call buck teeth, but Sarah's condition was the worse. By the time she was 14, she could scarcely close her lips. Walter Grimes agreed to pay for her orthodontia, and this meant that Sarah rode the train into New York once a week to spend the afternoon with him and to have her braces adjusted. Emily was jealous, both of the orthodontia and the city visits, but Pookie explained that they couldn't afford treatment for both girls at once. Her turn would come later when she was older. In the meantime, Sarah's braces were terrible. They picked up unsightly white shreds of food, and someone at school called her a walking hardware store. Who could imagine kissing a mouth like that? Who, for that matter, could bear to be close to her body for any length of time? Sarah washed her sweaters very carefully in an effort to keep the dyed color alive in their armpits, but it didn't work. A navy blue sweater would bleach to robin's egg blue under the arms, and a red one to yellowish pink. Her strong sweat, no less than her braces, seemed a curse. Another curse fell for both girls when Pookie announced that she'd found a wonderful home in a wonderful little town called Bradley, and that they'd be moving there in the fall. They had almost lost track of the number of times they'd moved. "Well, it wasn't so bad, was it?" Pookie asked them after their first day of school in Bradley. "Tell me about it." Emily had endured a day of silent hostility. One of the only two new girls in the whole 6th grade, and she said she guessed it had been all right. But Sarah, a high school freshman, was bubbling over with news of how fine it had been. They had a special assembly for all the new girls, she said, and somebody played the piano, and all the old girls stood up and sang this song. Listen. "How do you do, new girls? How do you do? Is there anything that we can do for you? We are glad that you are here, for you always bring good cheer. How do you do, new girls? How do you do?" "Oh," Pookie said happily, "wasn't that nice?" And Emily could only turn her face away in a spasm of disgust. It may have been nice, but it was treacherous. She knew the treachery implicit in a song like that. The grade school and high school were in the same big building, which meant that Emily could catch occasional glimpses of her sister, if she was lucky, during the day. It also meant they could walk home together every afternoon. The arrangement was that they would meet in Emily's classroom after school. But one Friday during football season, Emily found herself waiting and waiting in the empty classroom with no sign of Sarah until her stomach began to knot with anxiety. When Sarah did arrive at last, she looked funny. She had a funny smile, and behind her lumbered a frowning boy. "Emmy, this is Harold Schneider," she said. "Hi." "Hi." He was big and muscular and pimple-faced. "We're going to the game over in Armonk," Sarah explained. "Just tell Pookie I'll be home for dinner, okay? You won't mind walking home by yourself, will you?" The trouble was that Pookie had gone into New York that morning, after saying at breakfast, "Well, I think I'll get home before you do, but I better not promise." That meant not only walking home alone, but letting herself into the empty house alone to stare for hours at the naked furniture and the ticking clock, waiting. And if her mother ever did come home, where's Sarah? And how could she ever tell her that Sarah had gone off with a boy named Harold to a town called Armonk? It was out of the question. "How are you going to get there?" she inquired. "In Harold's car. He's 17. "I don't think Pookie'd like that, Sarah. And I think you know she wouldn't like it. You better come on home with me." Sarah turned helplessly to Harold, whose big face had twitched into a half smile of incredulity, as if to say he'd never met such a bratty little kid in his life. "Emmy, don't be this way," Sarah implored, with a quaver that proved she was losing the argument. "Be what way? I'm only saying what you know." And in the end, Emily won. Harold Schneider slouched away down the hall, shaking his head. He could probably find another girl before game time. And the Grimes sisters walked home together, or rather in single file, with Emily in the lead. "Damn you, damn you, damn you," Sarah said behind her on the sidewalk. "I could kill you for this." And she took 3 running steps and kicked her little sister solidly on one buttock, causing Emily to fall on her hands and spill all her school books, the loose leaf binder breaking open and scattering its pages. "I could kill you for ruining everything." It turned out, ironically, that Pookie was home when they got there. "What's the matter?" she asked, and when Sarah had told the whole story, crying, it was one of the very few times Emily had ever seen her cry. It became clear that all the mistakes of the afternoon had been Emily's. "And were there a lot of people going to the game, Sarah?" Pookie inquired. "Oh yes, all the seniors and everybody." Pookie looked less bewildered than usual. "Well, Emily," she said sternly, "that wasn't good at all, what you did. Do you understand that? It wasn't good at all." There were better times than Bradley. That winter, Emily made a few friends with whom she fooled around after school, which tended to make her worry less about whether Pookie would be home or not, and during that same winter, Harold Schneider began taking Sarah to the movies. "Has he kissed you yet?" Emily inquired after their 3rd or 4th date. "None of your business." "Come on, Sarah." "Oh, all right. Yes, he has." "What's it like?" "It's about like what you'd imagine." "Oh." And Emily wanted to say, "Doesn't he mind your braces?" but thought better of it. Instead, she said, "What do you see in Harold anyway?" "Oh, he's very nice," Sarah said, and went back to washing her sweater. There was another town after Bradley, and then still another. In the last town, Sarah graduated from high school with no particular plans for college, which her parents couldn't have afforded anyway. Her teeth were straight now, and the braces had come off. She seemed never to sweat at all, and she had a lovely full-breasted figure that made men turn around on the street and made Emily weak with envy. Emily's own teeth were still slightly bucked and would never be corrected. Her mother had forgotten her promise. She was tall and thin and small in the chest. You have a coltish grace, dear," her mother assured her. "You'll be very attractive." In 1940, they moved back to the city, and the place Pookie found for them was no ordinary apartment. It was a once-grand, shabby old floor-through on the south side of Washington Square, with big windows facing the park. It cost more than Pookie could afford, but she scrimped on other expenses. They bought no new clothes and ate a great deal of spaghetti. The kitchen and bathroom fixtures were rusty antiques, but the ceilings were uncommonly high, and visitors never failed to remark that the place had character. It was on the ground floor, which meant that passengers on the double-decked Fifth Avenue buses could peer into it as they made their circuit of the park on the way uptown. and there seemed to be a certain amount of flair in this for Pookie. Wendell L. Willkie was the Republican candidate for president that year, and Pookie sent the girls uptown to work as volunteers in the national headquarters of something called Associated Wilkie Clubs of America. She thought it might be good for Emily, who needed something to do. More importantly, she thought it would give Sarah a chance to meet people, by which she meant suitable young men. Sarah was 19, and none of the boys she'd liked so far, from Harold Schneider on, had struck her mother as suitable at all. Sarah did meet people at the Wilkie clubs. Within a few weeks, she brought home a young man named Donald Clellan. He was pale and very polite, and dressed so carefully that the first thing you noticed about him was his clothes. A pinstriped suit, a black Chesterfield with a velvet collar, and a black derby. The derby was a little odd. They hadn't been in style for years, but he wore it with such authority as to suggest that the fashion might be coming back. And he spoke in this same meticulous, almost fussy way he dressed. Instead of saying something like that, he always said something of that nature. "What do you see in Donald, anyway?" Emily asked. "He's very mature and very considerate," Sarah said. "And he's I don't know, I just like him." She paused and lowered her eyes like a movie star in a close-up. "I think I may be in love with him." Pookie liked him well enough, too, at first. It was charming for Sarah to have such an attentive suitor, and when they solemnly asked her permission to become engaged, she cried a little but raised no objection. It was Walter Grimes to whom the engagement was presented as an accomplished fact, who asked all the questions. Who exactly was this Donald Clellan? If he was 27, as he claimed, what business or profession had he been in before the Wilkie campaign? If he was as well educated as his manner implied, where had he gone to college? Where, for that matter, was he from? Why didn't you just ask him, Walter? I didn't want to grill the kid over a lunch table with Sarah sitting there. I thought you'd probably have the answers. Oh, you mean you've never asked him anything either? Well, he always seems so... No, I haven't. There followed several tense interviews, usually late at night after Pookie had waited up for them, with Emily listening just outside the living room door. "Donald, there's something I've never quite understood. Where exactly are you from?" "I've told you, Mrs. Grimes, I was born here in Garden City, but my parents moved around quite a lot. I was raised chiefly in the Middle West, various parts of the Middle West. After my father died, my mother moved to Topeka, Kansas. That's where she makes her home now." "And where did you go to college?" "I thought I told you that too, when we first met. The fact is, I haven't been to college. We couldn't afford it. I was fortunate enough to find work in a law firm in Topeka. Then after Mr. Wilkie's nomination, I worked for the Wilkie Club out there until I was transferred here." "Oh, I see. And that seemed to take care of it for one night, but there were others." "Donald, if you only worked in the law office for 3 years, and if you went there right after high school, then how can you be..." "Oh, it wasn't right after high school, Mrs. Grimes. I held a number of other jobs first. Construction work, heavy laboring jobs, things of that nature. Anything I could get. I had my mother to support, you see." "I see." In the end, after Wilkie had lost the election and Donald was working at some vague job with a brokerage house downtown, he contradicted himself enough times to reveal that he wasn't 27. He was 21. He'd been exaggerating his age for some time because he'd always felt older than his contemporaries. Everyone in the Wilkie clubs had thought he was 27, and when he'd met Sarah, he said 27 automatically. Couldn't Mrs. Grimes understand an indiscretion like that? Couldn't Sarah understand? "Well, but Donald," Pookie said, while Emily strained to hear every nuance of the talk, "if you haven't told the truth about that, how can we trust you about anything else?" "How can you trust me?" "Well, you know I love Sarah. You know I have a good future in the brokerage business." "How do we know that?" "No, Donald, this won't do. It won't do at all." After their voices stopped, Emily risked a peek into the living room. Pookie looked righteous and Sarah looked stricken. Donald Clellan sat alone with his head in his hands. There was a little ridge around the crown of his well-combed, brilliantined hair marking the place where his derby had been. Sarah didn't bring him home again, but she continued to meet and go out with him several times a week. The heroines of all the movies she had ever seen made clear that she couldn't do otherwise. Besides, what about all the people to whom she introduced him as my fiancé? He's a liar, Pookie would shout. He's a child. We don't even know what he is. I don't care, Sarah would shout back. I love Donald and I'm going to marry him. And there would be nothing for Pookie to do but flap her hands and cry. The quarrels usually ended with both of them collapsed in tears in different parts of the musty, elegant old apartment, while Emily listened and sucked her knuckles. But everything changed with the coming of the new year. A family moved in upstairs that Pookie found immediately interesting. Their name was Wilson, a middle-aged couple with a grown son, and they were English war refugees. They had been through the London Blitz. Geoffrey Wilson was too reserved to talk much about it, but his wife Edna could tell dreadful stories. And they'd escaped to this country with only the clothes on their backs and whatever they could carry in their suitcases. That was all Pookie knew about them at first, but she was careful to linger around the mailboxes in the hope of striking up further conversations. And it wasn't long before she knew more. The Wilsons aren't really English at all, she told her daughters. You'd never guess it from their accents, but they're Americans. He's from New York. He comes from an old New York family, and she's a Tate from Boston. They went to England many years ago for his business. He was the British representative for an American firm, and Tony was born there and went to an English public school. That's what the English call their private boarding schools, you know. I just knew he'd been to an English public school because of the delightful way he talks. He says, I say, and oh rot, and things like that. Anyway, they're wonderful people. Have you talked to them yet, Sarah? Have you and me? I know you'd both love them. They're so, I don't know, so wonderfully English. Sarah listened patiently enough, but she wasn't interested. The strain of her engagement to Donald Clellan was beginning to show. She was very pale, and she'd lost weight. Through people in the Wilkie campaign, she had found work for a token salary in the offices of United China Relief. She was called chairman of the debutante committee, a title Pookie loved to pronounce, and her job was to supervise the rich girls who volunteered to collect nickels and dimes along Fifth Avenue to help the Chinese multitudes in their war against the Japanese. The work wasn't hard, but she came home exhausted every night, sometimes too tired even to go out with Donald, and she spent much of her time in a brooding silence that neither Pookie nor Emily could penetrate. And then it happened. Young Tony Wilson came hurrying downstairs one morning, his fine English shoes barely touching the tread of each warped step, just as Sarah walked out into the vestibule, and they almost collided. "Excuse me," she said. "Excuse me, are you Miss Grimes?" "Yes, and you're Tony Wilson. I live upstairs." Their talk couldn't have lasted more than 3 or 4 minutes before he excused himself again and left the house, but it was enough to bring Sarah sleepwalking back into the apartment, allowing herself to be late for work. The debutantes and the Chinese multitudes could wait. "Oh, Emmy," she said, "have you seen him?" "I passed him in the hall. I've passed him in the hall occasionally." "Well, isn't he something? Isn't he just about the most beautiful person you've ever..." Pookie came into the living room, her eyes wide and her uncertain lips glistening with breakfast bacon grease. "Who?" she said. "You mean Tony?" "Oh, I'm so glad. I knew you'd like him, dear." And Sarah had to sit down in one of their moth-eaten easy chairs to catch her breath. "Oh, Pookie," she said, he looks just like Laurence Olivier." That was true, though Emily hadn't thought of it before. Tony Wilson was of medium height, broad-shouldered, and well-built. His wavy brown hair was carelessly arranged across the forehead and around the ears. His mouth was full and humorous, and his eyes always seemed to be laughing at some subtle private joke that he might tell you when you got to know him better. He was 23 years old. A very few days later he knocked on the door to ask if he might have the pleasure of Sarah's company for dinner some evening soon. And that was the end of Donald Clellan. Tony didn't have much money. "I'm a laborer," he said. which meant that he worked at a big naval aircraft plant on Long Island and very likely did something of top secret importance. But he owned a 1929 Oldsmobile convertible and drove it with flair. He would take Sarah on drives into the far reaches of Long Island or Connecticut or New Jersey, where they'd have dinner at what she always described as wonderful restaurants, and they'd always be back in time for a drink at a wonderful bar called Anatole's, which Tony had discovered on the Upper East Side. Now, this fellow's a different story entirely, Walter Grimes said on the telephone. I like him. You can't help liking him. Our young people seem to be getting on rather well, Mrs. Grimes, Geoffrey Wilson said one afternoon, with his wife smiling beside him. Besides, it's time for us to get better acquainted. Emily had often seen her mother flirt with men before, but never quite so openly as the way she flirted with Geoffrey Wilson. "Oh, that's marvelous," she would cry at his every minor witticism, and then she'd dissolve into peals of deep-throated laughter, pressing her middle finger coquettishly against her upper lip to conceal the fact that her gums were shrinking and her teeth going bad. And Emily thought the man was funny. It wasn't so much what he said, she decided, as the way he said it. But she was embarrassed by Pookie's enthusiasm. Besides, a little too much of Geoffrey Wilson's humor depended on his strange delivery, in which the heavy English accent seemed compounded by a speech impediment. He talked as though he held a billiard ball in his mouth. His wife Edna was pleasant and plump and drank a good deal of sherry. Emily was always included in her mother's afternoons and evenings with the Wilsons. She would sit quietly and nibble salted crackers through their talk and laughter. But she would much rather have been out with Sarah and Tony, riding in that splendid old car with her hair blowing attractively in the wind, strolling with them along some deserted beach and then coming back to Manhattan at midnight and sitting in their special booth at Anatole's while the pianist played their song. "Do you and Tony have a song?" she asked Sarah. A song? Sarah was painting her fingernails, and she was in a hurry because Tony would call her in 15 minutes. "Well, Tony likes Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, but I sort of like All the Things You Are." "Oh," Emily said, and now she had music to accompany her fantasies. "Well, they're both good songs. And you know what we do?" "What?" "Well, when we're having our first drink, we kind of hook our arms around each other's like this. Here, I'll show you. Careful on my nails." And she slipped her wrist through the crook of Emily's elbow and brought an imaginary glass to her own lips. Like that. Isn't that nice? It certainly was. Everything about Sarah's romance with Tony was almost too nice to be borne. "Sarah? Would you go all the way with him if he asked you to?" "You mean before we're married?" "Oh, Emily, don't be ridiculous." So it wasn't quite as profound a romance as some she'd read about, but even so, it was very, very nice. That night, Emily lay steaming in her bath for a long time, and when she'd gotten out and dried herself, with the bath water slowly draining away, she stood posing naked at the mirror. Because her breasts were so meager, she concentrated on the beauty of her shoulders and her neck. She pouted and parted her lips very slightly, the way girls did in the movies when they were just about to be kissed. "Oh, you're lovely," said a phantom young man with an English accent, just out of camera range. "I've wanted to say this for days, for weeks, and now I must. It's you I love, Emily." "I love you too, Tony," she whispered, and her nipples began to harden and rise on their own accord. Somewhere in the background, a small orchestra played All the Things You Are. "I want to hold you. Oh, let me hold you, and I'll never let you go." "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, Tony, I need you, Emily. Will you go all the way with me?" "Yes. Oh, yes, Tony, I will. "Emmy," her mother called from outside the locked door. "You've been in that bathroom for over an hour. What are you doing in there?" At Easter time, Sarah's employers lent her an expensive dress of heavy silk, said to be a model of the kind of clothes worn by aristocratic Chinese ladies before the war, and a broad-brimmed hat of closely woven straw. Her assignment was to mingle with the fashionable crowds on Upper Fifth Avenue and to get her picture taken by a photographer from the Public Relations Office. "Oh, you look stunning, dear," Pookie said on Easter morning. "I've never seen you look so lovely." But Sarah only frowned, which made her all the lovelier. "I don't care about the silly Easter parade," she said. "Tony and I were planning to drive out to Amagansett today." "Oh, please," Pookie said. "It'll only be for an hour or two. Tony won't mind." Then Tony came in and said, "Oh, I say," smashing. And after looking at Sarah for a long time, he said, "Look, I have an idea. Can you wait 5 minutes?" They heard him charge upstairs, seeming to shake the old house. And when he came back, he was wearing an English cutaway, complete with flowing ascot, dove gray waistcoat, and striped trousers. "Oh, Tony," Sarah said. "It wants a pressing," he said, turning around for their admiration and shooting his cuffs. "And one really ought to have a gray topper, but I think it'll do. Ready?" Emily and Pookie watched from the windows as the open car rolled past on its way uptown, Tony turning briefly from the wheel to smile at them, Sarah holding her hat in place with one hand and waving with the other. And then they were gone. The public relations photographer did his job well, and so did the editors of the Roto Revere section of the New York Times. The picture came out the following Sunday in a page full of other less striking photographs. The camera had caught Sarah and Tony smiling at each other like the very soul of romance in the April sunshine, with massed trees and a high corner of the Plaza Hotel just visible behind them. "I can get 8x10 glossies from the office," Sarah said. "Oh, wonderful," Pookie said. "Get as many as you can, and let's get more newspapers too. Emmy, get some money out of my purse. Run down to the newsstand and get 4 more papers. Get 6. "I can't carry that many." "Of course you can." And whether she was annoyed or not as she left the house, Emily knew how important it was to have as many copies as possible. It was a picture that could be mounted and framed and treasured forever. They were married in the fall of 1941 in a small Episcopal church of Pookie's choosing. Emily thought the wedding was nice enough, except that the dress she had to wear as a bridesmaid seemed contrived to call attention to her small breasts, and also that her mother wept throughout the ceremony. Pookie had spent a lot of money on her own dress and a rich little hat, both in a new shade called Shocking Pink, and she'd spent many days regaling anyone who would listen with the same weak joke. "How would that look in the newspapers?" she asked time and again, pressing her middle finger to her upper lip. "The bride's mother wore shocking pink." She drank too much at the reception, too, and when the time came for her to dance with Geoffrey Wilson, she batted her eyelids and sank as dreamily into his arms as if it were he and not his son, who looked like Laurence Olivier. He was visibly embarrassed and tried to loosen his hold on her back, but she clung to him like a slug. Walter Grimes kept mostly to himself at the party. He stood nursing his scotch, ready to smile at Sarah whenever she smiled at him. Sarah and Tony went to Cape Cod for a week, while Emily lay worrying about them. What if Sarah was too nervous to do it right the first time? And if it wasn't right the first time, what could you possibly talk about while you waited to try again? And if it became a matter of trying, wouldn't that spoil everything? Then they settled into what Pookie described as a wretched little apartment near the Magnum Aircraft plant. "But that's only temporary," she would tell her friends on the telephone. "In a few months, I'll be moving into the Wilsons' estate." Have I told you about the Wilsons' estate? Geoffrey Wilson had inherited from his father 8 acres of land in the hamlet of St. Charles on the north shore of Long Island. The place had a 14-room main house. Pookie always described it as a wonderful old house, though she hadn't seen it yet. That was where Geoffrey and Edna would live as soon as the present tenant's lease expired next year. And there was a separate cottage on the property that would be perfect for Sarah and Tony. Didn't that sound like the ideal arrangement? Pookie talked so much about the Wilsons' estate all winter that she seemed scarcely to realize the war had started. But Emily realized almost nothing else. Tony was an American citizen, after all. He would probably be drafted and trained and sent somewhere to have his handsome head blown off. "Tony says it's nothing to worry about. Sarah assured her one day when Emily and Pookie went out to visit the wretched apartment. Even if he is drafted, he's pretty sure the higher ups at Magnum will arrange to get him assigned back to the plant as enlisted naval personnel. Because Tony doesn't just work at Magnum, he's practically an engineer. He had almost 3 years apprenticeship with an engineering firm in England. That's the way they do it over there, you see. They have apprenticeships instead of engineering school. And the people at Magnum realize that. He's a valuable man. He didn't look very valuable when he came home from the plant that afternoon, wearing green work clothes with an employee identification badge clipped over his heart, carrying his tin lunchbox under his arm, but despite that costume, he managed to radiate the old, elegant vigor and charm. Maybe Sarah was right. I say, he said, won't you join us for a drink? He and Sarah sat close together on the sofa and carefully went through the ritual from Anatole's, entwining their arms to take the first sip. Do you always do that? Emily inquired. Always, Sarah said. That spring, Emily was awarded a full scholarship to Barnard College. Wonderful, Pookie said. Oh, darling, I'm so proud of you. Just think, you'll be the first member of our family with a college education. Except for Daddy, you mean? Oh, well, yes, I suppose that's right, but I meant our family. Anyway, it's just wonderful. Tell you what, let's do. Let's call Sarah right away and tell her, and then you and I'll get all dolled up and go out and celebrate. They did call Sarah. She said she was very pleased, and then Emily said, I'm going to call Daddy now, okay? Oh, well, all right, certainly if you want to. A full scholarship, he said. Wow, you must have really impressed those people. She arranged to meet him for lunch the following day in one of the dark basement restaurants he liked near City Hall. She got there first and waited near the coat room, and she thought he looked surprisingly old as he came down the steps wearing a raincoat that wasn't quite clean. Hello, honey, he said. My God, you're getting tall. We'd like a booth for two, George. Certainly, Mr. Grimes. And maybe he was only a copy desk man, but the head waiter knew his name. The waiter knew him too, knew just which kind of whiskey to bring and set before him. That's really great about Barnard, he said. It's the best news I've had in I don't know how long. Then he coughed and said, Excuse me. The drink brightened him. His eyes shone and his mouth tightened pleasantly, and he had a second one before the food arrived. Did you go through Syracuse on a scholarship, Daddy? She asked, or did you pay your way? He looked puzzled. Go through Syracuse? Honey, I didn't go through. I only went to Syracuse for a year, then I started working on the town paper up there. Oh, you mean you thought I was a college graduate? Where'd you get that idea, your mother? I guess so, yeah. Well, your mother has her own way of dealing with information. He didn't eat all of his lunch, and when the coffee came, he peered down at it as if it didn't appeal to him either. I wish Sarah could have gone to college, he said. Of course, it's fine that she's happily married and all that, but still, education is a wonderful thing. Then the cough hit him again. He had to turn away from the table and press a handkerchief to his mouth and nose, and a small vein stood out in his temple as he coughed and coughed. When it was over, or nearly over, he reached for his water glass and took a sip. That seemed to help. He was able to take several deep breaths, but then his breath caught and he was coughing again. You do have a bad cold, she said when he'd recovered. Oh, it's only partly the cold. It's mainly the damn cigarettes. You know something? 20 years from now, cigarettes will be against the law. People will have to get them from bootleggers, the way we did with liquor during Prohibition. Have you thought about what major you'll be in? Have you thought about what you'll major in? English, I think. Good. You'll read a lot of good books. Oh, you'll read some that aren't so good too, but you'll learn to distinguish between them. You'll live in the world of ideas for 4 whole years before you have to concern yourself with anything as trivial as the demands of workaday reality. That's what's nice about college. Would you like some dessert, little rabbit? When she got home that day, she thought of facing down her mother with the truth about Syracuse, but decided against it. There was no hope of changing Pookie. Nor was there any hope, it seemed, of changing the way they had come to spend their evenings together since Sarah's marriage. Occasionally, the Wilsons would invite them upstairs, or come down. More often, the two of them sat reading magazines in the living room while cars and Fifth Avenue buses droned past the windows. One or the other of them might make a plate of fudge, more to kill time than to satisfy any real craving, and on Sundays there were good programs on the radio. But for the most part, they were as idle as if they had nothing to do but wait for the telephone to ring. And what could be less likely than that? Who would want to call up an aging divorcee with rotten teeth or a plain skinny girl who moped around feeling sorry for herself all the time? One night, Emily spent half an hour watching her mother turn the pages of a magazine. Pookie would slowly, absently wipe her thumb against her moist lower lip, then wipe the thumb against the lower right-hand corner of each page for easier turning. It left the corners of all the pages wrinkled and faintly smeared with lipstick. And tonight she had eaten fudge, which meant there would be traces of fudge as well as lipstick on the pages. Emily found she couldn't watch the process without grinding her teeth. It made her scalp prickle, too, and made her squirm in her chair. She got up. "I think I'll go to a movie," she said. "There's supposed to be a fairly good one at the 8th Street Playhouse." "Oh, well, all right, dear, if you want to." She escaped to the bathroom to comb her hair, and then she was free of the house, walking out into Washington Square, taking deep breaths of the gentle air and taking a small but honest pride in the fit and hang of her almost new yellow dress. It was just after dark, and the park lamps were glowing in the trees. "Excuse me, miss," said a tall soldier, walking beside her. "Can you tell me where Nick's is, the jazz place?" And she stopped in perplexity. "Well, I know where it is. I mean, I've been there a few times, but it's sort of hard to tell you how to get there from here. I guess the best thing would be to go down Waverly to 6th Avenue, no, 7th Avenue, and then turn right, and go uptown about 4 or 5. No, wait. Your quickest way would be to go down 8th Street to Greenwich Avenue. That'll take you." And the whole time she was babbling that way, waving her hands to make inaccurate directions, he stood smiling patiently down at her. He was a homely boy with kind eyes and looked very trim in his bright tan summer uniform. "Thanks," he said when she was finished, "but I got a better idea. How'd you like to take a ride on the 5th Avenue bus?" Climbing the steep, curved staircase of an open-topped double-decker had never before seemed the beginning of a perilous adventure, nor had it ever made her aware of the pump of her heart. When they rode past her house, she shrank away from the railing and averted her face in case Pookie happened to be looking out the window. One lucky thing was that the soldier did most of the talking. His name was either Warren Maddox or Warren Maddox. She would have to ask him to clear that up later. He was on a 3-day pass from Camp Croft, South Carolina, where he had completed infantry training, and he would soon be shipped out to a division, whatever that meant. His home was a small town in Wisconsin. He was the oldest of 4 brothers, and his father was in the roofing business. This was his first visit to New York. "You lived here all your life, Emily?" "You lived here all your life, Emily?" "No, I lived mostly in the suburbs." "I see. It must be funny for a person to live here all their life, never get a chance to get out and run or anything. I mean, it's a great city, don't get me wrong. I just mean I think the country's better for growing up." "You in high school?" "Not anymore. I'm going to Barnard College in the fall." After a moment, she added, "I have a scholarship there." "A scholarship? Hey, you must be smart. I better watch my step around a girl like you." And with that, he let his hand slip from the wooden back of the seat to hold her shoulder. His big thumb began massaging the flesh near her collarbone as he talked. "What kind of work's your dad do?" "He's a newspaper man." "Oh, yeah? Is that the Empire State Building up ahead?" "Yes." "I thought so. Funny. I've seen pictures of it, but you don't really get the idea of how big it is. You've got nice hair, Emily. I never have much liked curly hair on a girl. Straight hair is a lot nicer." Somewhere above 42nd Street, he kissed her. It wasn't the first time she'd been kissed, not even the first time she had been kissed on top of a Fifth Avenue bus. One of the boys in high school had been that brave. but it was the first kiss of its kind ever. At 59th, he mumbled, "Let's take a walk," and helped her down the rumbling stairs. Then they were in Central Park, and his arm was still around her. This part of the park was crawling with soldiers and girls. They sat necking on benches, and they walked in groups or in couples with their arms around each other. Some of the walking girls had let their fingers slip into their soldiers' hip pockets. Others held them tighter up under the rib cage. She wondered if she was expected to put her arm around Warren Maddox, but it seemed too early in their acquaintance for that. Still, she had kissed him. Could early or late be said to matter anymore? He was still talking. "No, but it's funny. Sometimes you meet a girl and it doesn't seem right at all. Other times it does. Like, I've only known you for about half an hour, and now we're old friends." He steered her down a path where there didn't seem to be any lights at all. As they walked, he dropped his hand from her shoulder and worked it up under her arm to cradle one breast. His thumb began to stroke her erect, extraordinarily sensitive nipple, which weakened her knees, and her arm went around his back as a matter of course. A lot of guys just want one thing from a girl, especially after they're in the army. I don't understand that. I like to get to know a girl, get to know her whole personality, you know what I mean? You're nice, Emily. I always have liked skinny girls. I mean, slender girls. Only when she had felt grass and earth underfoot did she realize they had left the path. He was leading her out across a small meadow, and when they came into near total darkness under a rustling tree, there was nothing awkward about the way they sank to the ground together. It was as smooth as a maneuver on a dance floor, and it seemed dictated by his thumb on her nipple. For a little while while they lay writhing together and kissing, and his big hand was moving high up her thigh, and he was saying, "Oh, let me, Emily, let me. It's okay, I've got something, just let me, Emily." She didn't say yes, but she certainly didn't say no. Everything he did, even when he helped her to free one foot from her underpants, seemed to happen because it was urgently necessary. She was helpless and he was helping her, and nothing else mattered in the world. She expected pain, but there wasn't time to brace herself before it was there. It took her by surprise, and with it there began an insistent pleasure, building to what gave every promise of ecstasy before it dwindled and died. He slipped out of her, sank one knee into the grass beside her leg, and rolled away, breathing hard. Then he rolled back and took her in his arms. "Oh," he said, "oh." He smelled pleasantly of fresh sweat and starched cotton. She felt sore and moist and thought she might be bleeding, but the worst thing was being afraid they would find nothing to talk about. What did you talk about after something like this? When they were back under a park lamp, she said, "Is my dress dirty?" And after he had put on his overseas cap with great care, he fell a step behind her to look. "No, it's fine," he said. "You didn't even get any grass stains. Want to go for a malted or something?" He took her in a taxi to Times Square, where they drank big chocolate malteds at a stand-up counter and didn't talk at all. Her stomach seemed to constrict on receiving this stuff. She knew she would be sick, but she drank it anyway because it was better than standing there with nothing to say. By the time she'd finished it, her nausea was so acute she didn't even know if she could make it all the way home before vomiting. "Ready?" he said, wiping his mouth, and guided her out to the crowded sidewalk by one elbow. "Now you tell me where you live, and we'll see if we can find it on the subway." Everyone they passed looked grotesque, like figures in a fever dream. A leering bespectacled sailor, a drunken man in a purple suit, a muttering old woman carrying 4 greasy shopping bags. There was a wire mesh municipal trash container on the corner, and she ran for it and made it just in time. He came up behind her and tried to hold her arms during the seizure, but she shook free of him. She wanted to go through this bleak, humiliating business alone. When the spasms were over, even the dry ones, she found some Kleenex in her purse and cleaned her mouth. But the taste of vomited chocolate malted was still rich in her throat and nose. "You okay, Emily?" he inquired. "Want me to get you a drink of water?" "No, that's all right. I'm fine. I'm sorry." On the downtown IRT local, he sat reading the advertisements or inspecting the faces of passengers across the aisle, saying nothing. Even if she'd known how to start a conversation, the train was too loud. They would have had to shout, and soon another more dismal thought occurred to her now. Now that she'd vomited, he wouldn't want to kiss her goodnight. When they got off the train, the fresh air felt good, but their silence continued all the way to Washington Square and to the approximate place in the park where they'd met. "Where's your home, Emily?" "Oh, you better not take me home. I'll just say goodnight here." "You sure? Will you be okay?" "Sure, I'm fine." "Okay then." And sure enough, all he did was squeeze her arm and give her a little kiss on the cheek. "Take care now," he said. Only after turning back to watch him walk away did she realize how much was wrong. They hadn't exchanged addresses and promises to write. She wasn't even sure of his last name. "Emmy?" Pookie called from her bed. "How was the movie?" A week later, Pookie answered a ringing telephone at 10 o'clock in the morning. "Oh? Yes, hello. He what? Oh my God. When?" "I see. God. Oh God." And when she'd hung up the phone and said, "Your father died this morning, dear." "He did?" Emily sat down in a creaking straight chair with her hands in her lap, and she would always remember that on first hearing the news she felt nothing at all. Pookie said "God" a few more times as if waiting for it to sink in, and then she began to weep. When her sobs had abated, she said it was pneumonia. He'd been sick for over a week, and the doctor was trying to treat him at home, but you know Daddy. "What do you mean I know him?" "I mean, you know. As long as he was in his own apartment, he had his scotch and his cigarettes. Then finally he agreed to go into the hospital yesterday, but it was too late." "Who called you? The hospital?" "Mrs. Hammond. You know, Irene Hammond, your father's friend." But Emily didn't know. She'd never heard of Irene Hammond, and now, as it occurred to her that Irene Hammond had probably been much more than a friend, she began to feel something for the first time. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was more like regret. "Oh, how I dread calling Sarah," Pookie said. "She's always been her father's baby." When she did call her, Emily could tell just from hearing Pookie's end of the talk that Sarah's grief was immediate and profound. But if Sarah had always been her father's baby, whose baby was Emily? At the mortuary, they had laid Walter Grimes out to look much younger than his 56 years. They'd given him pink cheeks and lips, and Emily didn't want to look at him. But Sarah leaned over and kissed the corpse on the forehead. Then Pookie kissed it on the mouth, which made Emily shudder. Irene Hammond turned out to be a trim, nice-looking woman in her 40s. "I've heard so much about you girls," she said. And when she shook Tony Wilson's hand, she said she'd heard a lot about him too. Then she turned back to Emily and said, "I can't tell you how pleased your father was about that scholarship." The crematory was somewhere in Westchester County, and they rode out there in the limousine following the hearse. Sarah and Tony on the jump seats, Pookie and Emily in the back. Behind them came another car carrying Irene Hammond and the few of Walter Grimes's relatives who'd been able to come down from upstate, and then came other cars bringing employees of the New York Sun. There wasn't much of a ceremony at the chapel. An electric organ played, a tired-looking man read a few non-denominational prayers, the casket was removed, and it was over. "Wait," Sarah said as they filed outside, and she hurried back to her pew and crouched alone to let a last convulsion of sobbing overcome her. It was as if all her mourning in the past few days had not been quite enough. It was required that her bowed face crumple and her shoulders shake one final time. And Emily had yet to shed a single tear. It troubled her all the way back to the city, and she rode with one hand sandwiched between her cheek and the cool shuttering glass of the limousine window, as if that might help. She tried whispering "Daddy" to herself, tried closing her eyes and picturing his face, but it didn't work. Then she thought of something that made her throat close up. She might never have been her father's baby, but he had always called her Little Rabbit, and she was crying easily now, causing her mother to reach over and squeeze her hand. The only trouble was that she couldn't be sure whether she cried for her father or for Warren Maddox, who was back in South Carolina now, being shipped out to a division. But she stopped crying abruptly when she realized that even that was a lie. These tears, as always before in her life, were wholly for herself, for poor, sensitive Emily Grimes, whom nobody understood and who understood nothing. Sarah gave birth to 3 sons in 3 years, and the way Emily could always keep track of their ages was by thinking, Tony Jr. was born in my freshman year, Peter in my sophomore year, Eric when I was a junior. Oh dear, the way they're breeding, Pookie said on hearing of the 3rd pregnancy. I thought only Italian peasants did things like that. The 3rd pregnancy turned out to be the last. The boys would remain a family of 3, but Pookie always managed to suggest, with a rueful little rolling of the eyes, that 3 was plenty. Even the news of the 1st pregnancy had seemed to upset her. Well, of course I'm pleased, she'd told Emily. It's just that Sarah's so young. Pookie had given up the place on Washington Square. She'd found modest employment in a Greenwich Village real estate office and moved into a small walk-up just off Hudson Street. Emily had come down from Barnard to spend a weekend with her, and Pookie was fixing sardine sandwiches for lunch. She priced the last oily shred of sardine from the can with 2 fingers. Besides, she said, and sucked the fingers. Besides, can you imagine me as a grandmother? Emily wanted to say, I can't even imagine you as a mother, but controlled herself. The important thing on these weekends was to survive them. And tomorrow they were going out to St. Charles, Long Island for Emily's first pilgrimage to the Wilsons' estate. How far, did you say? Oh, I forget the exact number of miles, Pookie said, but it's only a couple of hours on the train. It's really quite a pleasant trip if you take along something to read. Emily took along one of her freshman English texts, but she'd scarcely settled down with it before the conductor punched their tickets and said, Change of Jamaica? What did he say? You always have to change at Jamaica for the St. Charles train, Pookie explained. It doesn't take long. But it did. They stood for half an hour on the windy Jamaica platform before their train came clattering in, and that was only the beginning of the journey. Were all Long Island trains this loud and dirty and badly in need of repair, or only those going to St. Charles? When they got off at the tiny station at last, Pookie said, There aren't any taxis, of course, because of the war, but it's only a short walk. Aren't the trees beautiful? Smell this fresh air. On the short main street of St. Charles, they passed a liquor store and a hardware store and a grubby little store offering blood and sandworms. Then they were on a country road, and the heels of Emily's spectator pumps kept turning under her as she walked. Is it much farther? She asked. Just beyond this next field. Then we go past a wooded area that's part of the estate, and then we're there. I can't get over how beautiful everything is. And Emily was willing to acknowledge that the place was nice. Overgrown, but nice. A driveway led off the road into the trees and the high rustling hedges, where it forked. Pookie said, The main house is over there. You can just see a corner of it, but we'll see it later. And Sarah's cottage is this way. It was a bungalow of white clapboard with a little lawn, and Sarah came out to greet them on the lawn. Hi, she said. Welcome to the house at Poop Corner. She said that as if she'd rehearsed it, and the way she was dressed showed considerable preparation, too. Bright, fresh maternity clothes that might have been bought for the occasion. She looked lovely. She served a lunch that was almost as inadequate as one of Pookie's meals. Then the problem was the conversation kept petering out. Sarah wanted to hear everything about Barnard, but when Emily began to talk, she saw her sister's eyes glaze over in smiling boredom. Pookie said, Isn't this nice? Just the 3 of us together again? But it wasn't really very nice at all, and for most of the afternoon they sat around the sparsely furnished living room in attitudes of forced conviviality. Pookie smoking many cigarettes and dropping ashes on the rug. Three women with nothing much to say to one another. Color illustrations of Magnum Navy fighter planes in action occupied one wall. On another was a framed Easter photograph of Sarah and Tony. Geoffrey Wilson had invited them over to the main house for a drink, and Pookie kept watching the clock. She didn't want to be late. You two go ahead, Sarah said. If Tony gets home in time, we'll join you, but he probably won't. He's been putting in a lot of overtime lately. So they went to the main house without her. It was built of white clapboard, too, and it was long and ugly. 3 stories high in some places and 2 in others, with black-roofed gables jutting out into the trees. The first thing that hit you when you went inside was the smell of mildew. It seeped from the brown oil paintings in the vestibule, from the creaking floor and carpets and walls and gaunt furniture of the long dark living room. It's an old house, Geoffrey Wilson was saying as he poured a shot of whiskey for Pookie, and it's too big to manage without servants, but we try to cope. Will you have scotch too, Emily, or will you join Edna in some sherry? Sherry, please. And the worst problem is the heating, he went on. My father built it as a summer place, you see, and there's never been a proper heating system. One of the tenants did put in an oil burner that looks vaguely adequate, but I imagine we'll have to shut off most of the rooms this winter. Well, cheers. I think it's a charming house, Pookie said, settling down to enjoy the cocktail hour. I won't hear a word against it. Look, Emmy, see the lovely old portraits? They're some of Geoffrey's ancestors. There are stories connected with every single thing in this room. Mostly very dull stories, I'm afraid, Geoffrey Wilson said. Fascinating stories, she insisted. Oh, Geoffrey, I can't tell you how I've come to love it out here. All the lovely meadows and the woodland and Sarah's cottage and this wonderful old house. It has such, I don't know, such flair. Does it have a name? A name? You know, the way estates have names, like Jalna or Green Gables. Geoffrey Wilson pretended to think it over. The way it looks now, he said, I suppose we might call it overgrown hedges. And Pookie didn't realize he was kidding. Oh, I like that, she said. Not overgrown, though. That's not quite right. What about... She worked her lips. What about great hedges? He said kindly. Yes, rather nice. That's what I'm going to call it anyway, she announced. Great Hedges. St. Charles, Long Island, New York. Well, he turned to Emily, how are you finding your college? Oh, it's very interesting. Emily took a sip and sat back to watch her mother get drunk. She knew it wouldn't take long. With the second drink, Pookie began to monopolize the talk, telling long, pointless anecdotes about houses she'd lived in, hunching forward in her deep chair with her elbows on her slightly parted knees. Emily, sitting across from her, could watch her face loosen as she talked and drank, watch her knees move farther apart until they revealed the gartered tops of her stockings, the shadowed, sagging insides of her naked thighs, and finally the crotch of her underpants. No, but the nicest house I ever had was in Larchmont. Remember Larchmont, dear? We had real casement windows and a real slate roof. Of course, we couldn't afford it, but the minute I saw it, I said, that's where I want to live. And I went right in and signed the lease, and the girls loved it. I'll never forget how... Oh, thank you, Joffrey. Just one more, and then we've really got to be... Why couldn't she get drunk quietly, with her legs curled up in the cushions like Edna Wilson? A little more sherry, Emily? No thanks, I'm fine. And of course the schools were wonderful in Larchmont. That's one reason I wish we could have stayed. Still, I've always thought it did the girls a world of good to move around to different places. And then, of course... By the time she was ready to leave at last, Geoffrey Wilson had to help her to the door. It was getting dark. Emily took her arm. It felt soft and weak, and they made their way past trees and overgrown shrubbery toward the long road to the railroad station. She knew Pookie would sleep on the train. She hoped she would, anyway. It would be better than if she'd stayed awake and talked. And their dinner, if they had any, would be a hot dog and coffee in Penn Station. But she didn't mind. The weekend was almost over, and in a matter of hours she'd be back in school. School was the center of her life. She had never heard the word intellectual used as a noun before she went to Barnard, and she took it to heart. It was a brave noun, a proud noun, a noun suggesting lifelong dedication to lofty things and a cool disdain for the commonplace. An intellectual might lose her virginity to a soldier in the park, but she could learn to look back on it with wry, amused detachment. An intellectual might have a mother who showed her underpants when drunk, but she wouldn't let it bother her. And Emily Grimes might not be an intellectual yet, but if she took copious notes, even in the dullest of her classes, and if she read every night until her eyes ached, it was only a question of time. There were girls in her class, and even a few Columbia boys, who thought of her as an intellectual already, just from the way she talked. "It's not just a bore," she said once of a tiresome 18th century novel, "it's a pernicious bore." And she couldn't help noticing that several other girls made liberal use of the word pernicious around the dormitory during the next few days. But there was more to being an intellectual than a manner of speaking, more even than making the dean's list every semester, or spending all your free time at museums and concerts and the kind of movies called films. There was learning not to be stricken dumb when you walked into a party full of older, certified intellectuals, and not to make the opposite mistake of talking your head off, saying one inane or outrageous thing after another in a hopeless effort to atone for whatever inane or outrageous thing you'd said 2 minutes before. And if you did make a fool of yourself at parties like that, you had to learn not to writhe in bed afterwards in an agony of chagrin. You had to be serious, but this was the maddening paradox. You had to seem never to take anything very seriously. "I thought you did very well," said a rumpled man at a party during her sophomore year. "I what? What do you mean?" "Just now, when you were talking to Laszlo. I was listening." "Talking to who? You didn't even know who he is?" "Clifford Laszlo, political science. He's a tiger." "Oh. Anyway, you did very well. You weren't intimidated and you weren't aggressive either." "But he's just a funny little man in bifocals." "That's funny." And he shook his plump shoulders to simulate a spasm of laughter. "That's really funny. A funny little man in bifocals. Can I get you a drink?" "No, actually, well, all right." His name was Andrew Crawford, and he was a graduate assistant in philosophy. His damp hair hung in his eyes as he talked, and she wanted to comb it back with her fingers. He wasn't really as pudgy as he'd seemed at first glance. He was attractive in his own way, especially when he was tense with talking, but he looked as though he ought to spend more time outdoors. When he got his doctorate, he said he would continue to teach. "If the army doesn't get me, and there's not much chance of that, I'm a physical wreck." And he would also travel. He wanted to see whatever would be left of Europe, and he wanted to go to Russia too, and China. The world would be made over again in unforeseeable ways, and he didn't want to miss any of it. Essentially, though, he wanted to teach. "I like the classroom," he said. "I know it sounds stuffy, but I like the academic life." "What's your field?" "Well, I'm only a sophomore. I'm an English major, but I don't really." "Really? You look older than that. I mean, you don't look older, but you seem older. The way you move around, the way you handled old Laszlo. I could have sworn you were a grad student. You have a very, I don't know, you seem very sure of yourself. In a good way, I mean. These parties get a little thick after a while, don't you think? Everybody shouting each other down, everybody trying to score points. It's all ego, ego, ego. You ready for a refill?" "No, I'd better be going." "Where do you live? I'll take you home." "No, actually, I'm with someone." "Who?" "You wouldn't know him. Dave Ferguson. He's over there by the door, the tall one." "Him? But he's only about 15 years old." "That's silly. He's 21. Why isn't he in the army, strapping youth like that?" "He has a bad knee." "A trick knee, right?" Andrew Crawford said. "A football knee. Oh, yes, dear God, I know the type." "Well, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything at all. I never imply. I always say exactly what I mean. Anyway, I have to go." "Wait." And he started after her through the crowd. "Could I call you sometime? Can I have your number?" As she wrote down the number, she wondered why she was doing it. Wouldn't it have been perfectly easy to say no to Andrew Crawford? But that was the trouble. It wouldn't have been easy. There was something about him. His eyes, his mouth, his soft-looking shoulders that suggested he'd be hurt beyond all reason if you said no. "Thank you," he said, putting her number in his pocket. "And you looked as pleased as a child singled out for praise. Oh, thank you." "Who is the little fat guy?" Dave Ferguson inquired when they were out on the street. "I don't know, a graduate student in philosophy. I wouldn't exactly call him fat." After a while she said, "Arrogant, though." And then she was troubled again. "You couldn't exactly call him arrogant either. He sure had the hots for you." "You say that about everybody." It was a clear night, and she enjoyed walking with Dave Ferguson. He held her close, but not in the clutching, almost desperate way some boys did. His legs matched her stride perfectly, and their heels made a sharp, invigorating cadence on the street. "Can I come up?" he asked her at her doorstep. She had her own apartment in approved student housing now. She had let him come up 3 or 4 times, and twice he had stayed all night. "I don't think so tonight, Dave," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I'm really very... What's the matter? Are you sick?" "No, it's just that I'm so tired and I want to go right to sleep. And I've got that awful Chaucer exam tomorrow." After turning back to watch him retreat up the sidewalk, hunched in his raincoat, she wondered why she had sent him away. Life was confusing. One distressing thing Emily learned in college was to feel more intelligent than her sister. She had felt more intelligent than her mother for years, but that was different. When it happened with Sarah, she felt she had betrayed a trust. She began to notice it when she and Pookie went out to St. Charles soon after Sarah's second boy was born. Tony Jr. was standing now, drooling and clinging to his mother's leg as they peered into the crib at the small new face. "Oh, I think Peter's a lovely name," Pookie said. "And you're right, Sarah, he is different. He and little Tony have whole different personalities, don't they, Emmy?" With the inspection over and the babies asleep, they sat around the living room and Sarah poured 3 glasses of sherry. She had evidently picked up sherry from Edna Wilson. "Oh, it feels so good to sit down," she said, and she did look tired. But she began to look refreshed as she talked. There were times, especially with a little alcohol in her veins, when Sarah could be almost as much of a talker as Pookie. "I couldn't help thinking of Daddy back in August or whenever it was when Italy surrendered. Did you see the papers that day, the headlines? Well, the news, that's the only paper we get. Tony likes it. The news headline was 'Italy quits.' But I happened to be down in the village that day, so I saw all the other papers. The Times and the Tribune said 'Italy surrenders,' or something like that, and so did most of the others. But do you know what the Sun said, Daddy's paper? The dear old Sun's headline was 'Italy capitulates.' Can you imagine? Can you imagine Daddy writing a headline like that, or ever allowing it to be written? He would have died. I mean," she added quickly, "he never would have let that happen." And she took a deep drink. "I don't get it," Emily said. "Oh, Emmy," Sarah said, "how many people know what capitulate means?" "Do you know what it means?" Sarah blinked. "Well, but I mean, how many other people do? And for a daily newspaper, that's supposed to reach millions of people. I don't know. I thought it was funny, that's all." "Marvelous," Pookie said. Sarah sat back in the sofa, tucking her ankles up beneath her. Had she copied that gesture from Edna Wilson too? And launched into her next monologue with the zest of a performer who knows her audience will be enthralled. "Oh, I must tell you this," she began. "First of all, I got a letter from Donald Clellan last year, and he..." "Donald Clellan?" Emily asked. "Did you really?" "Oh, just sort of a sad little letter. That's not important. He said he was in the army now, and he often thought of me, and he said he was out here at Camp Upton. So anyway, how long ago was that?" "I don't know, a year or so ago. Anyway, last month we had an air raid scare out here. Did you hear about that?" "Oh no," Pookie said, looking concerned. "Well, it was nothing, of course. That's the whole point. It only lasted a few hours. I wasn't frightened, but some of the little townspeople were. They talked about it for days afterwards. Anyway, they announced on the radio that one of the soldiers at Camp Upton had turned in the alarm by mistake, And I said, I told this to Tony, and he couldn't stop laughing. I said, I bet it was Donald Clellan. Pookie threw back her head for peal after peal of hearty laughter, showing her bad teeth, and Sarah was helpless with laughter too. Well, but wait, Emily said while her mother and sister were recovering. Camp Upton is only an induction center. They only stay there a few days before they go to other camps for basic training, and then they're shipped out to divisions. It was a year ago that Donald wrote you. He's probably overseas by now. And she would have added he might even be dead, but didn't want to overdo it. Oh, Sarah said, well, I didn't know that, but even so. Oh, Emmy, Pookie said, don't spoil the story. Where's your sense of humor? And she repeated the punchline to savor it. I bet it was Donald Clellan. Emily didn't know where her sense of humor was, but she knew it wasn't here, nor would it be in the main house later this afternoon, when she and Pookie went over there for their ritual visit with the elder Wilsons. She guessed she had left it, along with everything else that mattered back at school. For a little while she expected Andrew Crawford to call her any day. Then she stopped thinking about it. More than a whole year went by before he did. The year she became a junior. She had broken off with Dave Ferguson and spent 6 romantic, melancholy weeks with a boy named Paul Resnick, who was waiting to be drafted. He later wrote her a long letter from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, explaining that he loved her but didn't want to be tied down. She worked that summer in an Upper Broadway bookstore. English majors make good booksellers, the manager told her. I'll take an English major every time. And then the following winter, out of the blue, Andrew Crawford called her. I wasn't at all certain you'd remember me, he said, as they settled into a booth in a Greek restaurant near the Columbia campus. Why did you wait so long to call? I was shy, he said, opening his napkin. I was shy, and also I was miserably involved with a young lady whose name shall not be mentioned here. Oh, what do people call you anyway, Andy? What do people call you anyway, Andy? Oh, Lord, no, Andy suggests, some devilish hell for leather sort of fellow. Not my type at all, I'm afraid. I've always been called Andrew. A little hard to get your mouth around, I'll admit. Sort of like Ernest or Clarence, but I'm used to it. From the way he ate, she could tell he liked his food. He was a little chubby, and he didn't say much until he was full, by which time there was a faint shine of grease around his mouth. Then he began to talk as if talking were another sensual pleasure, using words like tangential and reductive. He talked of the war not as a cataclysm that might soon swallow him up, but he said for the second time that he was a physical wreck, but as a complex and fascinating international game. He went on to talk of books she'd never read and authors she'd never heard of, and then he was talking about classical music of which she knew almost nothing. And as you may know, the piano part in that sonata is one of the most difficult pieces in the world. Technically, I mean. Are you a musician too? Used to be, sort of. I studied piano and clarinet for many years, you know. I was one of these tiresome little creatures called gifted children. Then when it turned out I didn't have the talent to perform, I tried composing. Studied composition at Eastman until it was clear I didn't have much talent for that either. Then I gave up music altogether. It must be very painful to give up something like that. Oh, it broke my heart. But then, back in those days, my heart was getting broken on average about once a month, so it was only a matter of degree. What would you like for dessert? How often does your heart get broken now? Oh, somewhat less frequently, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year. What about dessert? They have marvelous baklava here. She decided she liked him. She didn't much like the grease around his mouth, but he wiped that away before digging into his baklava, and she liked everything else. No other boy she'd known had such a wide general knowledge and so many well-reasoned opinions. He was an intellectual, nor had any other boy had the maturity to be self-deprecating. But that was the point. He wasn't a boy. He was 30. He had come to terms with the world. She allowed herself to nestle close to his arm as they walked, and when they came to her doorway, she said, Would you like to come up for some coffee? He backed 2 steps away on the sidewalk, looking surprised. No, he said, no, really, thanks very much, some other time. And he didn't even kiss her. All he did was smile and make an awkward little wave of the hand as he turned away. Upstairs, she walked the floor for a long time with one knuckle in her mouth, trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. But he did call her again a few days later. This time they went to a Mozart concert, and when they got back to her place, he said he thought a little coffee might be pleasant. He sat on the sofa bed her mother had helped her buy at the Salvation Army outlet, and as she fussed around the kitchenette, she didn't know whether to sit beside him or in the chair across the coffee table. She chose to sit beside him, but he seemed not to notice it. When she leaned back, he leaned forward, stirring his coffee, and when she leaned forward, he leaned back. All this time he was talking, first about the concert and then about the war and the world and himself. She reached for a cigarette. She needed something to do with her hands. She had just lighted it when he made a lunge for her. Sparks flew into her hair and down the front of her dress. She was on her feet, brushing herself off, and he was all apologies. God, I'm sorry. That was clumsy. I'm always doing things like, you must think I'm... It's all right, she told him. You startled me, that's all. I know, I'm terribly sorry. No, really, it's all right. She got rid of the cigarette and sat down with him again. And this time his reaching arms went smoothly around her. His face was pink when he kissed her, and she noticed too that he didn't grope her. She noticed too that he didn't grope for her breasts and her thighs right away, as boys usually did. He seemed to enjoy just hugging and kissing, which he accompanied with soft little moans. After a while, he pulled away from her mouth and said, "When's your first class in the morning?" "Oh, it doesn't matter." "It does, though. Look at the time, really. I better go." "No, stay. Please. I want you to stay." And only then did he begin making love to her. Moaning, he tore off his coat and tie and dropped them on the floor. Then he urgently helped her to unfasten her dress. In a few quick, awkward motions, she made the sofa into a bed, and they were deep inside it, writhing and gasping and clinging together. His warm, heavy torso was soft to the touch, but he was strong. "Oh," he said. "Oh, Emily, I love you." No, don't say that. But it's true, I have to say it. I love you." He lay mouthing and sucking whatever nipples for a while, stroking her with his hands. Then his mouth went to the other one. After a long time, he rolled partly away from her and said, "Emily?" "Yes." "I'm sorry, I can't. This happens to me sometimes, I can't." "Oh, I can't tell you how sorry I am, it's just one of those... Does it make you hate me?" "No, of course not, Andrew." With a great deflating sigh, he heaved himself up and sat on the edge of the bed, and he looked so dejected that she put her arms around him from behind. "Good," he said. "That's nice. I like to have you hold me that way, and it's true. I do love you. You're delightful. You're sweet and healthy and kind, and I love you. It's just that I can't seem to demonstrate it tonight." "Shh, it's all right. Tell me the truth. Has this ever happened to you before? Has a man ever failed you this way before?" "Sure." "You'd say that even if it wasn't true." "Oh, God, you're a nice girl. Listen, though, Emily. It's a thing that only happens to me sometimes. Do you believe that?" "Of course. The rest of the time I'm fine. My God, sometimes I can screw and screw until... Shh, it's all right. It was just tonight. There'll be other nights. Do you promise? Do you promise me that?" "Of course." "That's marvelous," he said, and turned around to take her in his arms. But for a week, including several afternoons as well as nights and mornings, they tried and tried again without success. Afterwards, she remembered best about that week was the heat and sweat of their struggle and the smell of the bed. Several times she said it must be my fault, and he told her if she talked that way it would only make things worse. Once he almost accomplished it. He worked his way inside her, and she could feel him. "There," he said. "Oh, God, there. But it wasn't long before he slipped out and lay heavily on her, panting or sobbing in defeat. "I lost it," he said. "I lost it." She stroked his damp hair. "It was wonderful for a minute. That's kind of you, but I know it wasn't wonderful. It was only the beginning." Well, it was the beginning. Andrew, we'll do better next time. God, that's what I always say. Every time I leave you and go back into that miserable, brutal, screaming world, I think I'll do better next time. And it's always the same. Always, always the same. Shh. Let's just sleep now. Then maybe in the morning we'll. No, it's even worse in the morning. You know that. During a warm February thaw, he called her to announce he had made a decision. It couldn't be discussed on the phone. Could she meet him at the West End at 4:30? She found him alone at the bar with a stein of beer, one foot cocked, one foot cocked on the rail, and he walked with long strides as he led her to a booth, carrying his shoulders in an easy slouch. That was something she'd noticed before. When she met him somewhere, in a bar or on a street corner, he always moved with the demeanor of an athlete at rest. He sat close beside her in the booth, holding one of her hands between the beers, and told her he had decided to see a psychoanalyst. He had gotten the man's name from someone in the department. He had arranged for his first session and was willing to go as often as necessary. Twice, 3 times a week, he didn't care. It would take all of his savings and much of his salary. He might even have to borrow money, but there was no other way. Well, that's very brave of you, Andrew. He squeezed her hand. It's not brave, it's an act of desperation. It's something I probably should have done long ago. And Emily, this is the difficult part. I don't think we ought to see each other while I'm in therapy. Let's say for at least a year. Then I'll look you up again, and of course you'll probably be involved with another man. I can only hope you'll still be free. Because the point is I want to marry you, Emily, and You want to marry me? But you haven't even. Please, he said, closing his eyes as if in pain. I know what I haven't even done. I wasn't going to say that. I was only going to say you haven't even proposed to me yet. You're the sweetest, healthiest, kindest girl I've ever met, he said, and put his arm around her. Of course I haven't. How could I, under the circumstances? But as soon as this year is over, as soon as I'll come back and offer you the most heartfelt proposal of marriage you've ever heard. Do you understand, Emily? Well, yes, except that Well, yes, sure, I understand. That's marvelous. Now let's get out of here before I burst into tears. It was a pleasant day. Young couples crowded the sidewalk out to enjoy the fall spring. And he led her quickly to a florist shop on the corner. I'm going to put you in a cab and send you home, he said, but first I'm going to buy you flowers. No, that's silly. I don't want any flowers. Yes, you do. Wait. He came out of the shop with a dozen yellow roses and pressed them into her hands. Here, put them in water. Then you'll remember me at least until they die. Emily, will you miss me? Of course. Just pretend I've gone off to war like all the other better men you've known. All right? No long goodbyes. He kissed her cheek. Then he loped into the street, still moving in the athletic way that wasn't natural to him. He flagged down a taxicab and stood there holding the door open for her, smiling with bright eyes that looked a little out of focus. As the cab pulled away, she turned around in the heavy scent of roses to see if he would wave, but she caught only a glimpse of his back heading into the sidewalk crowd. Except that she wanted to cry. She didn't really know what she felt. She tried to figure it out all the way home until she discovered, climbing the stairs, that she felt a great sense of relief. Soon after the war ended in Europe, a young merchant, Seaman, came into the bookstore and began talking to her as if he'd known her all her life. His fingernails were broken and black, and he could recite long passages of Milton and Dryden and Pope from memory without seeming to show off. There was, he said, plenty of time for reading aboard ship. He wore a black sweater that looked too warm for season, and he had a big, blonde, handsome head that she described to herself as Nordic. He stood talking, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, holding a stack of books against his hip, and she felt a powerful urge to put her hands on him. She was afraid he might leave the store without asking her for a date, and he almost did. He said, "Well, see you," and started to turn away, but then he turned back and said, "Hey, listen, what time do you get off work?" He was staying in a rundown hotel in Hell's Kitchen. Soon she came to know everything about that hotel, from the smells of piss and disinfectant in the lobby, to the slow cage of the elevator, to the rattled green carpet in his room. And his ship was undergoing extensive repairs in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which meant he would be in New York all summer. His name was Lars Erickson. He was as hard and smooth as ivory, and beautifully proportioned. At first she thought she could never get enough of him. She liked to lie in his bed and watch him move naked around the room. He reminded her of Michelangelo's David. There were small carbuncular knobs on the back of his neck and out across his shoulders, but if she squinted very slightly, she didn't see them. And you've really had no education at all? Of course I have. I told you. I went through the 8th grade. And you really speak 4 languages? I never told you that. I'm only fluent in French and Spanish. My Italian's very sketchy, very primitive. Ah, God, you're wonderful. Come over here. She hoped he might want to be a writer or a painter. She had a vision of him working in a windswept beach cottage, like Eugene O'Neill, while she waited thigh deep to gather clams and mussels for their supper and the wheeling gulls screamed overhead. But he was perfectly content to be a seaman. He said he liked the freedom it gave him. Well, but I mean, freedom to do what? Not necessarily to do anything, freedom to be. Oh, I see. At least I think I see. She thought she saw a great many things in that voluptuous, invigorating summer with Lars Erickson. She thought she saw that her time in college was a waste. Maybe anybody's time in college was a waste. Maybe that had something to do with the tragedy of a man like Andrew Crawford. He had given his life to academia, not just his mind but his life, and it had shriveled his manhood. In any case, there was certainly nothing wrong with Lars Ericsson's manhood. It grew from him like the sturdy limb of a tree. It prodded and thrusted and plunged in her. It drove her slowly and steadily into a long sustained delirium for which the only possible expression was a scream. It left her weak and panting and feeling like a woman waiting for more. One night, as they lay exhausted in his bed, there was a knock on the door, and the voice of an adolescent boy called Lars. Lars, you home? I'm home, he called back, but I'm busy. I have a guest. Oh, I'll see you tomorrow, Marvin, he said. Or maybe not tomorrow, but, I'll see you around. Okay. Who was that? She asked when the footsteps went away. Just a kid from the ship. He likes to come in and play chess sometimes. I feel kind of sorry for him. He's all alone here, doesn't have much to do. You ought to get out and find a girl. Oh, I think he's too shy for that. He's only 17. I'll bet you weren't too shy at that age. Or, no, wait. I'll bet you were shy, but the girls wouldn't leave you alone. Not just girls, older women. Chic, sophisticated older women with penthouses, right? And they get you up in their penthouse and take off all your clothes with their teeth. And they run their tongues all over your chest and they go down on their knees and beg for you, right? Isn't that the way it was? I don't know, Emily. You've got quite an imagination. You kindle my imagination. You feed my imagination. No, feed me, feed me. One afternoon, he showed up at her apartment wearing a cheap new gas blue suit with padded shoulders. No Columbia boy would be caught dead in a suit like that, but that only added to its charm. And said he'd borrowed a car for the evening. Would she like to drive out to Sheepshead Bay and have a shore dinner? That'd be lovely. Who'd you borrow the car from? Oh, a friend. Man, I know. On the long drive through Brooklyn, he seemed preoccupied. He steered with one hand and used the other to play with his mouth, repeatedly pulling out his lower lip and letting it go back against his teeth, and he scarcely talked to her at all. She had hoped they might sit side by side in the restaurant so he could put his arm around her and they could murmur and laugh together throughout the meal. Instead, they were across from each other at a big table in the middle of a sawdust-sprinkled floor. Is there a place out here, she inquired, where we could go dancing after dinner? Not that I know of, he said around a mouthful of lobster. The food rode heavily in her stomach all the way home. There had been too much grease on the fried potatoes, and Lars didn't break his silence until he'd found a parking space near her building. Then, sitting in the stilled car and looking straight through the windshield, he said, Emily, I don't think we ought to see each other anymore. You don't? Why? Because I have to be true to my own nature. You're very nice, and we've had some good times, but I have to think of my own needs. I'm not tying you down, Lars. You're as free as. I didn't say you were tying me down. I simply said I have to be true to my own. Emily, the point is there's someone else. Oh? What's she like? It isn't a girl, he said, as if that would make it easier. It's a man. I happen to be bisexual, you see. All the moisture went out of her mouth. You mean homosexual? Of course not. You ought to know better than that. I said bisexual. Doesn't that amount to the same thing? No, not at all. But you like men better than women. I like both. I've enjoyed one kind of experience with you. Now I feel I'm ready for another. I see, she said. And when would she ever learn to stop saying I see about things she didn't see at all? He walked her to her door, and they stood facing each other on the sidewalk, a few feet apart. I'm sorry it has to end this way, he said. He put one hand low on his hip and gazed off down the street in order to let her admire his profile. And he looked more than ever like Michelangelo's David, even in that awful suit. So long, Lars, she said. There would be no more sex, she promised herself as she drove her fist repeatedly into the pillow upstairs. She would meet men, she would go out with them, and laugh and dance and do all the things you were supposed to do. But there would be no more sex until she was absolutely sure of what she was doing. She broke her promise in November with a haggard law student who said he was a communist, and broke it again in February with a witty boy who played the drums in a jazz combo. The law student stopped calling her because he said she was ideologically impure, and it turned out that the drummer had 3 other girls. Then it was spring again. She was about to graduate from college with no idea what to do with her life, and it was almost time for Andrew Crawford to end his psychoanalytical exile. Emily, he said on the telephone one evening, are you alone? Yes. Hello, Andrew. I can't tell you how many times I've started to dial this number and quit on the 7th digit. But you're really there, aren't you? I'm really talking to you. Listen, before I go any further, I've got to know this. Do you have a man? No. That's good. That's almost too good to be. I hardly dared hope for that. She met him at the West End of the following afternoon. 2 beers, he told the waiter. 2 very dry, extra dry martinis. He looked about the same, maybe a little heavier, she couldn't be sure, and his face was bright with nervous tension. Nothing's more boring than hearing about someone else's analysis, he was saying, so I'll spare you that. Let me just say it's been a tremendous experience. Difficult, painful. God, you can't imagine how painful, but a tremendous experience. It may go on for several more years, but I've turned the first corner. I feel so much better. The world isn't filled with terrors for me anymore. I feel I know who I am for the first time in my life. Well, that's wonderful, Andrew. He took a greedy sip of his martini and settled back in the booth with a sigh, dropping one hand to her thigh. And how about you, he said. How was your year? Oh, I don't know. All right. I vowed I wouldn't ask you this, he said, but now that I have your marvelous thigh in my hand, I've got to know. How many affairs have you had? 3? He winced. God. 3. I was afraid you might say 8 or 10, but in a way 3 is worse. 3 suggests real, important affairs. It suggests you've been in love with 3 different men. I don't know what love is, Andrew. I've told you that. You told me that last year and you still don't know? Well, good. That's something, anyway. Because you see, I do know what love is, and I'm going to work on you until you do, too. Oh, listen to me, work on you. That sounds as if I meant... God, I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I know. That's what Dr. Goldman keeps telling me. He says I've spent my life apologizing. There were more martinis at the Greek restaurant and wine with dinner, and when they started home to her place, he seemed a little drunk. She didn't know whether that was a good sign or a bad one. This is taking on all the aspects of a major sporting event, he said as they approached her steps. A championship fight or something. The contender's been in training for a year. Can he make it this time? Stay tuned for round 1 after this word from... Don't, Andrew. She settled her arm around his broad back. It's not like that at all. We'll just go upstairs and make love to each other. Oh, you're so sweet. You're so sweet and healthy and kind. They tried for hours. They tried everything, and it was no better than the best of their times last year. In the end, he sat slumped on the edge of the bed as if on a prizefighter's stool, his head hanging. So, he said, a technical knockout in the fourth round. Or was it only the third? You're the winner and still champion. Don't, Andrew. Why not? I'm only trying to make light of it. At least the sports writers will be able to say I was graceful in defeat. And the following night he scored a victory. It wasn't perfect. In its climactic moments, she failed to respond as fully as she knew she should, but it was what the author of any sex manual would have called an adequate performance. Oh, Emily, he said, when he recovered his breath. Oh, if only this had happened the first time last year instead of all those miserable nights of shh. She stroked his shoulder. That's all in the past now. Right, he said, all in the past. Now let's think about the future. They were married soon after her graduation in a civil ceremony at the municipal building. The only attendants or witnesses were a young married couple of Andrew's acquaintance named Kroll. When they walked out across City Hall Park afterwards for what Mrs. Kroll insisted on calling the wedding breakfast, Emily found herself in one of the busy lunchtime restaurants she had come to with her father long ago. They told their mothers first. Pookie wept into the telephone, as Emily had known she would, and made them promise to come and visit her the next night. Andrew's mother, who lived in Englewood, New Jersey, invited them for the following Sunday. Oh, he's nice, dear, Pookie said, when she cornered Emily in the cramped kitchen downtown while Andrew sat sipping coffee in the next room. I was a little, frightened of him at first, but when you get to know him, he's really awfully nice. And I love the sort of formal way he talks. He must be very intelligent. Andrew's mother was older than Emily had expected, a blue-haired, wrinkled, and powdered woman wearing knee-length elastic stockings. She sat on a chintz-covered sofa with 3 white Persian cats in a room that smelled of recent vacuum cleaning, and she blinked at Emily repeatedly as if having to remind herself that Emily was there. In a bright, airless sun porch called the music room, there was an upright piano and there was a framed studio photograph of Andrew at the age of 8 or 9, dressed in a sailor suit, seated on the piano bench with a clarinet across his chubby lap. Mrs. Crawford opened the keyboard and looked imploringly at her son. Play something for us, Andrew, she said. Has Emily heard you play? Oh, Mother, please. You know I don't play anymore. You play like an angel. Sometimes when there's Mozart or Chopin on the radio, I just close my eyes. She closed her eyes and picture you here, right here at this piano. In the end, he gave in. He played a short selection from Chopin, and even Emily could tell he was hurrying through it, seeming to play sloppily on purpose. God, he said when they were back on the train for New York, every time I go out there, it takes me days to recover, whole days just to get to the point where I can breathe again. Only one visit remained to be made, to Sarah and Tony in St. Charles, and they put it off until the end of the summer when Andrew had bought a used car. So, he said as they sped along the wide Long Island highway, at last I get to meet your beautiful sister and your dashing romantic brother-in-law. I feel as if I'd known them for years. He was in a sour, touchy mood, and she knew why. His sexual performance had been adequate all summer with occasional lapses, but just lately, in the past week or so, he had fallen back into the old habit of failure. Last night he had suffered a premature ejaculation against her leg, and afterwards he had wept in her arms. Was he in the service? Who? Laurence Olivier. Who'd you think I meant? I've told you, she said. He was drafted into the Navy, but they assigned him back to Magnum as a naval personnel. Well, at least he didn't storm the beaches at Normandy, Andrew said, and win the Silver Star with 14 Oakley clusters. We'll be spared that kind of an evening. It wasn't easy to find St. Charles from the spidery lines on the road map, but once they were in the village, she saw enough landmarks, blood and sandworms, to guide Andrew out to the Wilsons' place. Beside the driveway was a small hand-lettered sign reading "Great Hedges," and she recognized the lettering as Sarah's. The young Wilsons sat on a blanket on their front lawn with their three sons toddling and chirping around them in the afternoon sunshine. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't see their guests arrive. "I wish I had a camera," Emily called. "You make a lovely picture." "Emmy!" Sarah sprang to her feet and came forward across the bright grass with both arms held out. "And you're Andrew Crawford. It's so nice to meet you." Tony's greeting was less effusive. His smiling eyes, crinkled at the corners, seemed more amused than pleased, as if he were thinking, "Must I really put myself out for this fellow, just because he's married to my wife's little sister?" But he shook Andrew's hand firmly enough and managed to mumble appropriate things. "I didn't know even Eric was on his feet now," Emily said. "Certainly," Sarah told her. "He's almost 18 months old. And that's Peter there, the one with the cookie crumbs on his face, and the big one's Tony Jr. He's 3.5. What do you think of them?" "They're beautiful, Sarah." "We just came out here to get the last of the sun," Sarah said, "but let's go inside. It's cocktail time. Darling, would you shake out the blanket, please? It's all cookie crumbs." Cocktail time in the carefully cleaned-up living room meant that the Crawfords had to sit and watch with fixed smiles while the Wilsons went through the old Anatole's business of entwining arms for the first sip. For what seemed a long time after the party failed to ignite, shadows lengthened on the floor and the west windows turned bright gold, and still the four of them were stiff and shy. Even Sarah was less talkative than usual. She told no rambling anecdotes, and except for a few awkwardly phrased questions about Andrew's work, she seemed constrained in his presence, as if she might appear trivial to such a learned man. "Philosophy," Tony said, swirling the ice cubes in his empty glass. "I'm afraid that whole field's rather a mystery to me. It must be very difficult to read, let alone teach. How does one go about teaching it?" "Oh, well," Andrew said, we get up there and try to educate the little bastards." Tony chuckled approvingly, and Sarah turned her laughing face on him as if to say, You see, I told you Emmy wouldn't marry a creep." "I say, are we ever going to eat?" Tony inquired. "I'll have just one more cigarette," Sarah said. "Then I'll get the boys to bed, and then we'll have dinner." The small roast was badly overcooked, and so were the vegetables, but Andrew had been warned not to expect very much in the way of food. It began to seem that the visit might be a success after all, for all of them until they moved back into the living room after coffee. There were more drinks then, and taller glasses, and the trouble might have been partly that. Andrew wasn't used to drinking that much, and he grew a little over-earnest in recommending a Yugoslavian movie, or film, that he and Emily had seen. "I don't see how anyone could fail to be moved by it," he concluded, "anyone with belief in humanity." Tony had looked sleepy through most of the recital, but the last line brought him awake. "Oh, I believe in humanity," he said. "Humanity's perfectly all right with me." Then his mouth went into a subtle shape of wit, suggesting that his next remark would bring down the house. "I like everyone but coons, kikes, and Catholics." Sarah had started to laugh in anticipation of whatever he might say, but when she heard it, she cut her laughter short and lowered her eyes, displaying the fine little blue-white scar of the gymnastics bar long ago. There was an uneasy silence. "Is that something you learned in your English public school?" Andrew inquired. "Hmm?" "I said, is that something they taught you in your English public school, how to say something like that?" Tony blinked in bewilderment. Then he mumbled something inaudible. It might have been, "Oh, I say," or "sorry," or it might have been neither, and stared at his glass with a little jaded smile to show that he, for one, had had quite enough of this tiresome nonsense. Somehow a measure of decorum was restored. They managed to labor through a ceremony of small talk and smiles and good nights, and then they were free. "The country squire," Andrew said, gripping the steering wheel tight in both hands as they droned along the highway toward home. "He was raised with the English upper middle class. He's practically an engineer. He lives in a place called Great Hedges. He's sired 3 sons out of his beautiful wife, and he comes up with a remark like that. He's a Neanderthal. He's a pig." It was inexcusable, Emily said, "wholly inexcusable. Oh, and by the way, it's true what you told me, Andrew went on. They do read nothing but the daily news. When I went out to the bathroom, I passed a stack of daily newses about 3 feet high, the only bona fide reading matter in the whole lovey-dovey little house. I know. Ah, but you love him, don't you? What? What do you mean? I don't love him. You've told me, Andrew said. You can't take it back now. You've told me when they were first engaged you had fantasies about him. You had fantasies that you were the one he really loved. Oh, come on, Andrew. And I can imagine what you did to support those fantasies, to flesh them out, so to speak. I'll bet you masturbated over them, didn't you? Oh, I'll bet you tickled your little nipples until they came up hard and then you stop it, Andrew. And then you went to work on your clitoris, picturing him all the time, imagining what he'd say and how he'd feel and what he'd do to you. And then you spread your legs and shoved a couple of fingers up your. I want you to stop this, Andrew. If you don't stop it, I'll open this door and get out of this car and all right. She thought his rage would make him drive too fast, but he was carefully holding the car under the speed limit. His profile in the dim blue light of the dashboard was clenched in the look of a man controlling himself against impossible odds. She turned away from him and stared out the window for a long time, watching the slow movement of endless dark, flat land and the red throbbing of radio tower lights high in the distance. Did women ever divorce their husbands after less than a year of marriage? He didn't speak again until after they'd crossed the Queensboro Bridge, until after they crawled through the traffic to the west side and turned uptown, heading home. Then he said, "Do you want to know something, Emily? I hate your body. Oh, I suppose I love it too, at least God knows I try to. But at the same time, I hate it. I hate what it put me through last year, what it's putting me through now. I hate your sensitive little tits. I hate your ass and your hips, the way you move, the way they move and turn. I hate your thighs, the way they open up. I hate your waist and your belly and your great hairy mound and your clitoris and your whole slippery cunt. I'll repeat this exact statement to Dr. Goldman tomorrow, and he'll ask me why I said it. And I'll say, because I had to say it. So do you see, Emily? Do you understand? I am saying this because I have to say it. I hate your body." His cheeks were quivering. "I hate your body."